당연히 그지 기부 기부 ting게 남기림바 당연히 조다 기부 ting게 남기림베 내가서 저 코와라 근데 코리아 감숨 코리아 동안에 탈제 탈바 토고도 선배가 탈바도니게 삼바 자야디 다 저거 최고를 지상 탈바도니게 삼바 심지어 코리아 동안 타다 저지 탈바 토고도 선배가 탈바 삼바게 군에 라제 당한 저기다 제 진바도 수rim도 쇠바다 아니 전뒤 이제 띵에 정검이야 이제 최보부와 차세야 나사야 당한 저기와 가르치베네 남부 공원디 됐음제 탐 가서래 코리아 동안 타달을 줘야지 탈바도 맞는데 지금도 선배게 군원 탈바도 이게 네 군원 군에 라제 맞게 아니 계주도 보고 그래야세 나데네게 다 탈바 토구도 선배가 삼로디 단 야고시게라 근데 담보 코와라 내중 끼고 코와라 귀엔 마토바 있나 근데 코와라 탈고도 선배 삼바디 리도고 말해 진짜 코와라 귀엔 통와 있나 코와라 탈고도 선배게 삼바디 리도고 그래 델레바 있나 안 탈바 토고도 선배게 탈바 등에 삼로디 숙치 몰리고와 데네 인자 안 코와라 귀엔 통야게 귀엔 가르가르 요래 생각하다 그진소 다 나송게 동아 마송을 깨봐야는데 코와들라 깨들라 옆에 냐 가서래 되바다 수도 수메 감숨마도 깨와요 말다 다티 감숨나라 깨되는데 되바들라 냐와이다 둔로 아니 미 될게나 동아한테 요래서 되시지 다디나진다 할라 깨바는 수야 수를 깨봐야는 가려 요래서네 안 수를 깨나제 수메를 깨봐야는 제가 동아도 요래서 제가 동아를 내다 녀모 온 준비 동아 라신지 제가 될 동아 라신마도 셴 요 말에서 동아 라신에서 내가 저기다 감숨기 다 냐와이다 돈도 조리주기 땡기다 동아디 맞아 그생이다 된데된데 요래서 아직도 스모트지 다시 살아와 당선.
Good evening. So we're continuing to look at the practices associated with a being of intermediate capacity. And a being of intermediate capacity is distinguished by having the motivation that is determined to attain freedom from suffering, to attain liberation from the suffering realms of cyclic existence. So a practitioner who is a practitioner of intermediate capacity then, in everything they do, they are doing it so as to achieve liberation. So the motivation under which they act is one to achieve liberation from cyclic existence, freedom from all forms of suffering and pain. With such a motivation generated, then whether they're engaging in prostrations or making offerings, or if they're meditating on, for example, generosity or ethical restraint or patience and so forth, this is done with this motivation and thereby become causes that will lead to the attainment of freedom. But in order to generate such a motivation, it's not sufficient just to hear about liberation or even to hear about how one achieves this. Rather, one has to go through a specific process of accumulating knowledge and reflecting on that knowledge, giving rise to various forms of understanding that eventually leads to the rise of the motivation of definite emergence, the motivation that is definite about the need to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara into the state that is freed from samsara. And to give rise to such a motivation, one has to reflect repeatedly over a sustained period across on the various forms of suffering or expressions of suffering that beings throughout cyclic existence experience. Cyclic existence can be divided in differing ways. The most common is into the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. And back in February, we started to look at the sufferings, or we looked at the sufferings of the three lower realms in the desire realm, the sufferings of the beings who are born in hell, or as spirits, or as animals. And now, since June, we've started to look at the sufferings of the higher realms, the higher migrations within the desire realm, that of humans. And we looked at the sufferings experienced by humans in both the threefold and the eightfold division of suffering. And then last week, we also looked at the sufferings that are experienced by gods within the desire realm, as well as the gods within the form and formless realms. So we've looked at all of those, the sufferings experienced by beings. And in this way, one has the basis to continue one's reflection, to see how suffering pervades cyclic existence, that there is no birth or experience within samsara that is one of lasting happiness. It's only freedom from samsara, liberation, that is the state of lasting happiness.
Debe kamna, suji kamna, sumi bim kam kando jewa na leda nyumo ongi jewa karil, jewa lemba na da dunga rashima to mindu sam ta de, tena nga zo kar sam gorasne, da soso rarang, da da ngara, ana mo ba na leda nyumo ongi deba ke na da nyawa ida ke na dunga pat me ba nyongo ya desha. Chesan deba la da mil ke ba na dunga nyongo ya desha. Da soso rarang sam go da nga zo, da nga jewa chima de 아니 냐와다 이다 dundur kewa dunga paatu meba nyongo ya reshas. Ta leda nyongo onge ane mili kewa na mida debe hala kewa na dunga nyongo ya reshas. Ta ane leda nyongo onge ya suli kewa lemba na dunga nyongo da. Sumela kewa na kewa lemba na da dunga nyongo da. Chesan de kesa dela deba da su da sume suma du kesa ma da yomarwa da. Chesan dela kena da dunga nyongo da nga karache korase. Da dunga dela taya tapshi karache korase. Chesan leda nyummo monge di kewa lemba ina dunga nyungu wara. Chesan ta kewa legi gyu nye leda nyummo badi meba soyo kure chenga zo. Leda nyummo badi ngi ida meba maso nita nga denigi ngi dati diring dati nga kokab yudu kabla ngi leda nyummo badi meba maso ba ina ta nga delia kewa chima deni kewa langso dunga nyungo sare, dunga nyungo cho sare wa sembe. Denigi samta wa ina soso rarang pe shanda ke dunga yoro samta je soso rarang di dunga nyunga ke samta wa ina disease 소설에 소화를 두고 말해. 그래서 계속 동안 야외 이다 dunruwa 되네 동안 삼당 한 소설 하나 먹어봤는데 되게 봐는 동안 딩한 용고 지기로 와 선비게 삼당에도 되는 소설이야. 어당아디 동안에 타고 선비 삼리기로 와. 제가 대마지에게 탑시대 가르치고 섭니다. nyomobade leda nyomobade reshas 진짜 nyomobade 빠야 게시에 샤 땅에 nyomobade 빵고도 선비게 당한 저기 nyomobade 빵비 빵바이나 다 nyomobade 빵비 탈바세 토병 되네 토바이나 되는 아 되네기 코발이야 개발된 고민 동아들 다 투고도 세상에 대 nyomobade 빵고도 선비가다 될래 가서 삼다야데 디삼당어데 게시뭐 차거로 받아 가서 동아 삼담비기 dumde masona jelya nga zule tengi nyom ba de panggu du sempe ngaranga ju nyom ba de ma ba na thap minu ti panggu du sempe samdai de ta di pang pe ke thar ba de thob yong sempe dor de ye samna li yong ro.
It's important to engage in these meditations on the experiences that beings have throughout the realms of samsara. Seeing what are the experiences for beings that to us are unseen, as well as for the beings that are seen, other humans as well as animals. And understanding that our personal existence, our personal experience in this life, that we experience suffering, an unwanted situation upon unwanted situation, as do all other beings. There is no rebirth to long for. There is no rebirth to long for thinking that will be a rebirth of lasting happiness, as long as that rebirth remains within the realms of samsara. And a key point of this meditation is that a lot of the meditation will be done in relation to one's own experience in this life, when we're looking at the sufferings of humans, but also a lot of the meditation is done in relation to what the experience of other beings, whether humans or non-humans. And when one is reflecting on the experience of others, it's important then to bring that back to oneself. How would it be if I was experiencing such sufferings? Is that the goal I long for, that in my next life I also suffer like that, born in the lower realms or even in one of the other happy migrations? Is that a state really worthy of striving for? So it's important that one thinks like that, so that one can come to see that wherever one is born in the three realms, that is not worthy of striving for, because one continues to have the basis of suffering, the contaminated aggregates. And this needs to give rise to a sense of disenchantment within ourselves. Because it's through the sense of disenchantment that we'll look around us, in terms of looking around cyclic existence and seeing there's no state worthy of longing for. And that then is the bridge to think about the causes that keep us bound within this wheel of samsara, which we know from these preceding classes is the contaminated karma that we ourselves have accumulated under the influence of our own afflicted minds. And then we are ready to start focusing on that. So given rise to disenchantment, which comes from reflecting on suffering, we then look at eliminating the causes that keep us bound in suffering. Eliminating the contaminated karma that is accumulated by our own afflicted minds. And then, here we start to give rise to having a disenchantment having arisen. Now, these meditations lead to a great strength of mind, where we see, actually, now that I'm identifying the causes that keep me bound, I realize what it is that I need to eliminate. And here we give rise to the determination to abandon the afflicted minds together with their seeds. Because when we achieve that, when we achieve a state where the afflictions no longer can arise, that is the state of freedom. That is the state where we're freed of any suffering experience at all. And here we now give rise to the wish to strive for liberation.
강아 먹고 여바든 아주 통고를 받에 생규 토네 고고래든 직 생규 토네 아니 직 TV 날았다는 통고래 아니 베네 셈제나 베네 다지게 다미 셈제인데 아니 직 다다 생야라 소베기 바직 소잡네 바직 마시강야 아니 직 사야다 안냐디게 아니 직 냐주연디게 냐에 칼라야 안 자교 구제데 자교 바 자주제 탱네 태야다 되는 아주 통고래 이내 아주기 페닌 아니 아주기 나기여바디 삼단고 나기여바든 하고 고고로 와다 나기여바 하고 고고래 이내 아주려 소와디지 리고 말고 가르제네스네 소소가 라난기 땡려야 말아야 되네 둥아 용나 마몽바네 되네 지나 가르치기를 선배 삼로도 땡고 말고 지네 인자다 되니게 통요도는 마몽바나다 레다니 소소를 녀모바지 마바바 있나 소수기 녀몽바지 매버스 마토바 있나 녀몽가 레다 마라 사용고로 제산 사용에 되네시기 용고레스 다 기네 되네기네 나 되네가 녀고지는 가르치사래 삼비게 두스진 삼단데 소수 강래야 둥아 젠다게 둥아 녀타데 따제 디 녀타데 소수 강 삼다와네 다데 되네기 둥아데 딜레데 마탄데 탑미노 삼비게 삼로실리고로 와다 제산 디 둥아데 탑라디 게 규디가서 녀몽바데 녀몽바 마바나 탑미노 삼비게 삼로실리고레 삼로 축제레도고레 소수 강라 삼마다바나 파절 가르 통변에 있는 안주 편입에 즉 파절날이야 즉 셈젠ля 지주 제모제 파주데 나즈가제 여러 셈젠라 시나 가서 감다 가제 여러 이내 마하자 게무쇼 템보드는 게무쇼고 왔는 아주 게무쇼고 지나 디가선 편이 둥어 여바다 나즈 여바다 시나 감다 여바 하고고르데 나줄랴 안지게 기비게 남바디 게무쇼마도 안데니게 둥아티 타고 선배 삼 레투고 말 가라선 소솔레 둥아티 소솔 녀나 안 가르치기를 선배 삼로 땡고 말와 파쇼캬야 따지 소솔 삼 땡마 진짜 파쇼 둥어 녀나지 파따지 디 둥아티 갈 녀나 안 가르치기를 선배 삼 따면은 오 다데네데 베사사 다데네 둥어 녀도 강아 쳇세 델레 타고도 선배 삼로 리기로와 진짜 시행기데 둥아디 파 데네데데데 요래서 둥아레 시에 차여 제랴 데네기 나랑 좀 몸반 마데델레소나 둥아디나지 용고전다 가르치기리 삼비게 삼로시 코고래 데네게 삼로 따와있나 두스tam 삼따도 오다 대용의 규디다 녀몽바다 녀몽바데 방고도 삼비게다 녀몽바 빠야게 셈슈디 레트고르와
To emphasize this point that we need to take the experiences that others have elsewhere in samsara and relate to it as if it were ourselves, because the reality is We have those causes on our continuum for such experiences. So to emphasize this point, when next you're watching, whether it's the news or nature documentary, or reading in the newspaper or magazine about the experiences that other humans or animals have, think, how would it be if I was in that desperate situation? So, for example, many people enjoy watching nature documentaries and seeing how animals live, and they relax, and it's something quite enjoyable. But always within these documentaries, there's a part to do with feeding, and that often involves hunting, catching, eating the prey alive, and this we watch for entertainment. So watching it is fine, it's not that one shouldn't do so. But in order to actually utilize this opportunity of watching this documentary or watching the news as an opportunity that leads us to liberation, think to yourself, how would it be if I was that being fleeing for my life? How would it be if I was that being struggling, desperate to get away, or for my child not to be caught, or watching helplessly as it is? How would it be if it was me that had been caught by a predator and now, whilst I was still alive, being devoured? So we see this regularly on television in many different contexts. And rather than just relating to it as moving pictures before us, or having some passing appreciation that this is actually happening to others, think about how it would be if it was myself. Because I have the imprint on my continuum that can lead to that. Thinking like this then will lead to the determination that I must ensure I eliminate those imprints on my continuum and not accumulate new imprints of that type. I must abandon the afflictions together with their seeds. And in this way, we utilize opportunities such as these in a very skillful way. We utilize them to give rise to the wish to strive in every endeavor to attain liberation.
nyamomba pangpi tarbase toku goreche that te tobaina that dunga thada le dra chare jisada denti tobala deyang tarbase tobiala gyudan kinchi shenchile tene ma to kanla ma to ba toyasyo mares jisna dene inzada gyudan kinle tene duku goreche rwana.
Yeah, one's striving. One's making great effort to give rise to the wish, striving for liberation. What liberation is a state liberated from suffering. It's a state liberated from the afflicted minds. It's a state liberated from the afflicted minds together with their seed so that one never experiences suffering again. And just like cyclic existence comes about in dependence on causes and conditions, so too there are certain causes to achieve in order to attain freedom. And that brings us to our text. So we're on page 30, second sentence in the second paragraph, in the second main paragraph. Such a state is not without causes and conditions. So train in the practices that bring the actual attainment of liberation, that is, the practices of the three higher trainings, ethical conduct, concentration, and wisdom.
nyomba thada drive tharpa di pa shanda chile shaje an dinga zu de ya pha ro shi len yo ba samra ta na di de ne yo mar ba da garre labna so su gi le nyommo de gi di me ba so sa ba na tharpa thop sa da ga ji tharpa thop da ma thop sa de so su gi nyommo ba de me ba de le so ya de la ra le ba yo 제가 소수기 녀몽 매바데 쇠고 녀몽 매바 쇠서는 탈바세데 소수관 레용 거와 제가 탈바세데 아주기 녀몽 매바 쇠투 마트블 라리 거래 제가 소수기 녀몽 제가 디 매바 쇠발라 지 규단 긴 매발라 탈바세데 톱투 말레스 규단 긴 매도 미토베 규단 낀레 된 토고르지 제가 탈바 제가 다나 규단 낀레 된 토고고나 나가서 탈바 토에게 탑람 냠 규단 낀 가르레 된 토고고래 디 가르 베지 땅고래라나 톱지게 탑 아니 가르스나 라바숨 수진 냠슬랑고래 라바숨 냠슬랑고래 제레
As the sentence starts out by stating clearly, a state of liberation isn't a place one needs to travel to. A state of liberation isn't something that one takes off a shelf and now one has it. Liberation is achieved when the afflictions, together with their seeds, which abide on our own mental continuum, are eliminated. So the change is to be found within. The change is to be found within our own mental continuum. And that change is brought about independent on causes and conditions. Hence the text starts, or the sentence starts by saying, such a state is not without causes and conditions. And what are those causes and conditions? It is the practice of the three higher trainings. These three higher trainings are the method, the technique to engage in, to cultivate the causes that lead to the transformation of our minds, of our mental continuum, and the attainment of freedom.
anda laba sumdi garelamne laba churmi laba seada ani tingi singi laba ani sharake laba se laba sumbodi dire dadi ne chujin de nyamsalangore se dirwa laba sum seade.
The three trainings we trained in are the higher trainings of ethical conduct or ethical restraint, higher training of concentration, and the higher training of wisdom.
지자다 laba sum nyamlen je tarba topjige tabre esigore tarba topige tablamdi laba sum nyamso lembale tine tarba tokure esigore 지자 tarba topige tabre laba sumbodi 아주기 녀몽바 매바 소야기 메타 타브레다 지바레 tarba topjige tabre 아주 녀몽바 매바서 타브레 지자 laba sum nyamso lenyodu lembale tine 아주기 녀몽바데 매바서 거와 지자 아주기 녀몽바데 매바서도 안 tarba topju 가지 녀몽바데 라바숨가지 슈크체 냠는 제투베네 소수기 녀몽바데 마슈크 춘르르 땅거래 소수기 녀몽바데 가지 슈크춘르 따나 탈바데 소솔라야기 타녀르냐냐 주고라 토비야 타녀르냐 주고라 봐.
Method then for achieving liberation is training in these three higher trainings of ethical restraint, concentration, and wisdom. Likewise, the method for reducing and eventually eliminating the afflictions is training in the three higher trainings. We relate to this like thinking of or using the analogy of a scale. The stronger our training is in these three higher trainings, proportionately, our afflictions weaken. So on the one side, as these virtues of the three high trainings grow and develop, proportionately, the non-virtuous minds, which are the afflictions, weaken. And when eventually the culmination of these these three higher trainings, when they eventually manage to eradicate the afflictions completely, we are freed of the afflictions. We are liberated from the afflictions. And that is the state of liberation, the state of freedom, the state of nirvana, where only lasting, stable happiness can be experienced.
Laba sum nane da somebody and the ganas nyams lengore lamna and dinande dang churungi laba said that dangbo nyams lengore jere deyang so laba somebody dangbo khara nyams lengos and churungi laba nyams lengore se deyang so da deyang sa laba sumgi nane deyang laba shenni gi hiden me mirung laba churungi laba labgo yeso 지사 라바 젠니스 삼dengi 띵기징이 라바다 셰르기 라바니기 띵 히딘 마소나 아니 추링이 라바래 지선 추림이 라바데 냠수 야고 렘바는 텔라테네 아니 가지고 띵이징이 라바 이야기 줘야다 되는 시력이 라바 냠술래야 돼 지선 디네자 추링이 라바데 데 아니 띵이징이 라바다 시력 라바니기 띵 마서 시딘디레스 라바신이 시딘 매도 미로아레스데 추링이 라바데다 매나 아니 띵이징이 라바다 시력 라바데 용투에 매바와 디네자 매도 미로아 Then
returning to the text. Furthermore, as the higher trainings of concentration and wisdom depend and are based upon the higher training in ethical conduct, first train in it. So this is a crucial point I want to emphasize. If one has a strong desire to cultivate the wisdom realizing emptiness, or a strong desire to develop calm abiding, these cannot be attained without the prior development of the higher training of ethical restraint. Because it's independence on the basis of ethics that one can develop concentration and wisdom. Without this basis, the two higher trainings cannot be cultivated.
나 주름이 라바세데 가르라나 아 저기 다 예제 덤비 덤바 지금 했으면 손야 들어와 예제 손야 들에 네 다 류가 예수님 요거네 예제 아니 예제 지금 해야다 류가 예수님 미개와 쭉 손야 되다 아 저기 주름 손와야 돼 주름 손야 되라 아 저기 류가 예수님 예제 덤비 주름 손야 되다 아 저기 다 김바다 아는 아 저기 랍죠 술리네 차상 지바 창마 지바래 안 디나데다 랍종로야 안 상기에 제비게다 제한예바 송거야 마요로와
Let's then look at the first higher training, that of ethical restraint or ethical conduct. Ethical restraint, then what is meant by this? So the division we're most familiar with will be the abandonment of the 10 non-virtues. Or to express it more formally, the practice of ethical restraint, of restraining from the 10 non-virtues. Another way one can express this, ethical restraint is the restraint of one's body, the restraint of one's speech, and the restraint of one's mind. And these need to be practiced by everyone. Whether one's ordained or not ordained, there is no difference. One needs to restrain our physical behavior, restrain our speech, restrain our minds. And there's no difference whether one's ordained or not in terms of the need to cultivate this ethical restraint, because it is always the basis for the trainings of concentration and wisdom. The only difference is that for those who are ordained, the Buddha prescribed many more behaviors that need to be restrained from by the ordained as support for the abandonment of the afflictions. But other than that, all of us need to train in cultivating the ethical restraint of our body, speech, and mind.
난 드네 자당 저기 주름 송어서 류가 예수님 예제 덤비게 주름 송어도다 저기 류유관에 나 아니 제 녀바도냐 아니 이유관에 아니 녀바도냐 아니 가고관에 녀바도냐디 지사 저기 주름 띵이진 라바다 시라기 라비게 냠는 제발라 야보숑알라 류가 예수님 예제 덤바지 야보 마중 바이나 베네 나유관에 배샤리아 측습셔야다 견주해야다 아니 주인셔야다 아니 지금 파수 미즈 편절이야 주신자 직자 참아셔야 되는 제바이는 지상 아니 신의 야고금 두고 말와 가서네 삼로디 땅에도 되는 게 토나 남이야 먹보기에는 안디네 파래 되는 게 꽤 먹보지야 되네 미션다 수 시행용으로 되는지도 암초 먹보고야 먹보고 되는지도 안데 지상 류가 있으면 예제도 마토바이나 아니 나요고는 예제도 마토바이네 딩이제 야고 신의 주토야 갈래하고 제거래 되는 아주 류유고네 아직 류유고네 소주에야다 아니 지금 고마고야라 소바다 안데니게 신 자임 제발라 소바데네 제바이나 안데 소수게 예바산 디견진데 denu an chige jalang shu ma che da an mi shengi ne su le ne ba ji ya da an su le gang tim po ya da dene yo ba inza an dene gom ya ge ba che che ya go yong tu go ma ro che de dene inza ni di me da yi yu go ne sam ne sam lo shan la na sam ne sim lok da la so ba ge wa ina dene sam lo di kien chin su sem ma ge ba shan le ma ge wa su dene chi shan mi ge wa su de an shan ge su le ma ge wa su ge ro chu ye ne ba chi ge ro dene chi de an su ge sem de shi de hung ja de me na 아니 딩인정 검토야 하고 지고를 되네자 아 저기 냠내냐고 용하라 아니 류가 예수 예제된 비 추림도 순간 배 맛이 계시 버려서 왔다 되네 요송 바했는데 류가 예수 요거 예제 같이 망아 돈 바했네 바가바 있나 당아 저기 류가기 개와드 제도 자와치도 가지고서 망치 개위 자와기 안치로 왔더니 나기 권에 지게 예제되게 도묘도 되는 아이고네 자와제 망치네 지게 정부 밀 계시야바나 정부 장샤 시안리 판비기 계시야당 안지가는 저기 되게 용우라 되네자 령아 이숨 예제되면데 배마세 계침버리에서 지장한 저기 되네자 다 라바셴이 딘 시딘 조마선 디인세우로다
Ethical restraint, then, being the basis for concentration and wisdom, or the essential basis, is where we need to start training. And ethical restraint, as we then just heard, is the restraining of our body and speech and minds. So how then is it that ethical restraint is the basis for concentration and wisdom? So let's take then ethical restraint of one's speech. If one is engaging in the verbal non-virtues, such as lying, as harsh speech, as divisive speech, and gossip, if one is engaging in such non-virtues, how is that then an obstacle to the cultivation of concentration? How is it not conducive to the cultivation of concentration? Well, if one is engaging in lying and harsh speech and divisive speech and gossip, then one is creating problems for oneself and others. We are talking badly about others, we're talking badly to others, and this is creating problems in the lives of others, and that is likely to come back on us. And that prevents an obstacle to development of concentration. More importantly, though, in terms of development of concentration, when our mind is taken up with things such as gossip and divisiveness and harsh speech and lies, when our mental activity is dominated by this, we are very distracted. And then when we receive problems from others, or we're engaging in these conversations with others, our mind is very stirred up. This is not conducive at all to the cultivation of concentration. Taking that same understanding and applying it then to the non-virtues of physical behavior, so killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. Engaging in these causes harm to others, may cause harm in society, may cause harm in terms of what society accepts, what the law prohibits, and this all then comes back on us, creating distraction. But again, more particularly to the particular relevance to the cultivation of concentration, when our mind is caught up in thinking about these things, they serve as a great distraction. Our mind is distracted and we can't develop concentration. So here too we see how the lack of ethical restraint in terms of our physical behavior disturbs our mind and prevents the cultivation of concentration. And then of course, in terms of the mental non-virtues of covetousness, harmful intent and wrong views, these mental events, when our mind is involved with covetousness, with strong mental desire, with harmful intent or wrong views, how can we develop concentration? Our mind is too distracted. So through these distractions of not cultivating ethical restraint in relation to our physical behavior, our verbal behavior, and our mental behavior, our mind is too distracted, it's too afflicted to develop concentration. So the more we train in ethics, the more subdued our physical behavior is, our verbal behavior is, our verbal communication, and our way of thinking. The more subdued these three are, the easier it is to develop concentration, because being subdued means not distracted. How? The mind is on virtue. And this is how we train. Ethical restraint is not solely restraining from non-virtue. It's not even solely restraining from the afflictions. It is also placing the mind on the opposite to the afflictions, virtuous minds. The more habituated we become with minds of virtue, and thereby virtuous physical behavior, virtuous verbal communication, the more restrained we'll be, the more ethical we'll be, and the easier it is to cultivate concentration. So therefore, what is the technique to become ethical? It's to abandon the 10 non-virtues and to train in the opposite, the 10 virtues.
가능까지 연구를 디 하고 거래 디 하먹어나 니주에 가능까지 연구해 봐 하먹어나 안디 송타 송싱 말와 제가 니지 디니시네 녀바 연구 디니시네 녀바 연구를 하고 봐나 어디지는 녀바 연구를 디지가 말했으면 비게 송도 거래 제가 니디 시행하는 게 침으로 와서 니주를 류주고네 직세 대신 미국 주들은 니주라고 하다네 녀바라는 아주 교연식으로 와서 녀주에서는 교연식으로 와서 릉아 있으면 수준마송나 딜레 도초기 아니 가고네 디파사야 류고네 디파사야 이유고네 디파사야 대서 녀바식으로 와서 대속이 녀바사상 간에까지 연구해 봐 먹어봐했나 아니 녀주 녀발리 연구를 해지 그래서 하고 와야 돼 개침을 해지 내가 진짜 녀바 수준 송야라 송연자다 송발라 내 가르쳐 고래랍나 대양 미셰바서 동아 중위기 균남라 전시기 레버다네 당부로 동아 미중화식지에스
In order to be able to restrain or subdue our way of thinking, to subdue our way of verbally communicating, as well as subdue our behavior, we need to understand very clearly how faulty behavior comes about. So here let's turn to the text again in the fourth sentence in this paragraph. Because ethical conduct is easily broken when introspection and such forces degenerate, maintain clear thoughts firmly supported by introspection and mindfulness, and thus guard against all possible downfalls.
나 먼저 미개 와서 다 미개 와디게 간에서 용거래디 담보 용약이 귀하고 그래지 제가 미용 귀하 먹거나 아니 한쪽이 녀바디 바 송야를 깔하고 보지 그래서 귀하고네 된델이야 잡아다 시신 바 된제네 가 송고 그래지와 제가 대야 미셰바 소스데 녀바 중에 귀디 가래라네 미셰바세로 제가 녀바 가래가지기 용야 미셰바나 예수다 하 먹어봐야나 되네 미시바르와 미시바르 진짜 미시바나 될라되네 아니 디바 연구를 해 디바 사고 그래지 미시바도 지그래 되네 아주 밤에 봐서야 돼 밤에서야 돼 지그래 데 미시바 속라도 속나려야 미시바 그런 가르가르치네 근데 샘전 쇠나 디바 사고 그래서 하 먹거나 아니 샘전 쇠로와 지상아주 디바 가르가르 하고 미시바데 하 먹어야 돼 미시바세로 미시바도 지그래 미셰바를 때네 하나 저기 디바 먹고 사고 그랬지. 진짜 미셰바디 디바 영향 규칙이래. 나데네 밤에 쥐바 밤에 해야 돼. 쥐바 밤에 봐 제바나 안델레 되네 한 디바 지 디바 망아 사고 그래. 디바 사도 그랬지. 되네 함 가서 녀모바 소소줄라 녀모바 가지 슉체와이나 디제 딜레 되네 디바 망아 사도 그래. 사고 그랬어. 나야지 샤라 마구바 제바이나 안델레 되네 디바 용 그랬어. 지상한테 디보용의 규로지마 손에 조롱서 시고를 미셰바 바메바 아니 소주길에 녀모 마와 녀모 슈체와 아니 샬라 마구바 제바 디솔 마구바 샬라 마구바 제바 마구바라네 샬라 마가와 제츠오라 샬라 마가와 제네 아니 마가와는 견주시기로와 디기면서 제제 카타야 들리기로와 마구바라네 샬라 마가와 제바 디스고래 그래서 데니게 데니게 디소양 아주 디파사의 유로지 마선에 디소시로 실리고레세데
It's imperative then that one understands how faulty behavior comes about, because there are causes that lead to faulty behavior, and through identifying the causes well, one can guard one's mind from those causes. So the first of four that we'll look at is not knowing. So not knowing what is faulty behavior, what is harmful behavior, is the first cause. Because if one doesn't know, one cannot restrain oneself from engaging in such harmful behavior. The second is non-conscientiousness. So if one knows that something is harmful, but doesn't really care, that is non-conscientiousness. So if one has come to understand that killing leads to suffering, but doesn't really care in a particular circumstance, then one is still going to do so. One will not restrain oneself. Thirdly, the strength of one's afflicted minds. If one's afflicted minds are strong, they're going to dominate. They're going to overpower one. One will struggle to restrain oneself if the afflicted minds are strong. And fourthly, acting against the wishes of others. So then these are the four causes that we need to be aware of to guard against the rise of harmful behavior. Not knowing, non-conscientiousness, the strength of our afflicted minds, and acting against the wishes of others.
di kala di sana subul nugire di sana nug maresne amoko na 가르지네 ngazu 사식으로 dine sana subul nugene na sa lenguro 지난 kala di dine stigi nugo di sana nugo marse 하고 봐이나 di sana nugo에서 하고 봐나 남산 어디디 자기가 말다가 누기래서 비 남산 가그로와 디 나시리 ngazu 샬레 직습시나 ngazu 디바사기레 사다 주인시나 직비샤고 사고레스 안에 참아시나 안 디바사고레스 안에 데니기 안에 가짜지는 디바사고레스 하고 봐이나 안에 저 오다 주인시야게 어디 야고요 말다 디바사고레스 주인시에 송야 안 차상 송야 용으로 안디 나지 리주고네 구마구네 디바 용고레스 하고 봐이나 안에 어디디 구겨 말더니 바꾸야디 점거로 봐 진짜 구마구네 소소 캡사인 아니 구두 가지고 야가리 슈 야고레 삼바이나 되네 디보여 봐 먹어나 아니 구마가지고 구야 너 구구로 와 디나지로 디나시레 다치사 디제나 디보 용구로서 하고 그래서 하고 봐이나 안디 바 어디 바 송야라 송투구레스 가돔 제투디 잠바다 시신되네 아는 가지고 잠바든지 어디지 남사 통을 제연도 준시에가 삼례연도 어디지 준시에바나 안 디보 용구다 삼백에 남사 잠바 계제 안도시 잠바 계제 고 준시에데 바 지금에 선배 삼례 투구레스 지난 디네기 당보 안에 디제네 디보 용구를 디보 용구를 세배 시어야 하고 거야 돼 예신벌이 디 하먹어 와 있나 하먹어 와 있자 약 먹고 지내는 그 디보 먹고 사게 되지 디보 용의 귀기인지 하먹어 있기 먹고 사고 그러지.
The first of the four is not knowing. And this is the important one to overcome, because through the ignorance of not knowing, one will make many mistakes. We know about this in our own life. If we're regularly ill and we don't know why, we want to find out the causes. Or if we want to lead a healthy life, we need to know what food is nutritious and what food is unhealthy. If we don't know that, we'll just always eat what we like and whatever quantity we feel like eating, because we are ignorant. We lack the knowledge that we need to act in a way that will bring us the result we desire. So the starting point here is to know clearly what is harmful behavior. Harmful meaning it accumulates the causes for suffering. So, for example, the non-virtues of speech, lying, harsh speech, gossip, and divisive speech. We need to first know that it's these that lead to the accumulation of non-virtuous karma, and that therefore we will suffer, and they bring harm to others as well. Because if we don't know this, we are not going to guard ourselves, and especially if we have a strong habit to, for example, to tell small lies or to gossip and so forth, we'll struggle to overcome these habits. And if we don't know that it's harmful, we certainly will not even start. Likewise with a physical non-virtue of stealing. If we don't know that this leads to suffering, we will continue to take what we want, whether it belongs to someone else or not. So knowledge is the first point. Because based on knowledge, when we know that something is harmful and we understand clearly how it fits into the process that leads to suffering and fits into the process that prevents the development of good qualities, the qualities we desire, we can guard ourselves. Guard ourselves through the utilization of the virtuous minds of mindfulness and introspection. So, for example, when we come into a situation where we are in a conversation and we know here is a situation of danger for us. This is a situation where I may well tell a small lie. If we understand clearly that if we do so, that creates the cause for suffering, as well as serves as an obstacle for the development of good qualities, such as ethical restraint, independence on which we'll later be able to develop concentration and wisdom, we will then be able to use mindfulness and introspection to guard ourselves from making a mistake in that situation, from making the error of acting habitually and telling a small lie. So therefore the starting point is gathering of knowledge.
Da mishe ba dile tene ngazo ni so ha mo na an diba yung diba sa ya yu cha go jisa de tene chin diba yung go re sen di ha go ya de sing go ya de ge chin bo re je da so ju na diba yung go re zun shi na diba yung go re se be tene ki chen na diba yung go re se be di je na diba yung go re se she go de ge chin bo re je ni dang bo de ro da da ni ba me ba se da ji da she na da ma she be sing ba ne so su ge sem di pa 디비 촐 파마당바 제 셈디 송제 게위 촐 파다야게 삼마다바이나 셈팔로 샤바이나 베네 준신의 디보여라 셈비게 하고고이네 어디 셈디 마송아제 파 준시주에 파 셈을 파 디바 다바이나 아니 안 자산 디바디 마고 사리 그랬어 지산 밤에 번게 베네 가도 람가지 조베네 조디 갑라 신나지 람가 조디 직 삽섭지네 강바 주서들이야 야고 두미도 이엔도와 참마다 디네 강바 뇌서 두미도 삼당이 당이진데 강바 좀 조고도 어디 나싱아 저기 지금 저기 냠는 제도 갑다 디네 진다 디고 용거다 디 삼는 디땅교 말다 스메 삼로 까고 그래지래 지산 디치네 까고 마가와지 삼로데 가레나 당하샤바네 자선 셰와선베나 삼로데 디네 자선 셰야당 안지 나게 셰야당 안 삼네 가제갈 파 뢰샤바이나 근데 마음에 봐셔 그래 진짜 디네 인자 안에 자선 셰야당 구마고야당 디네 삼로데 디네 당연바네 디네 디바스 망사도 그래 진짜 셈데 바여바 바메바 디 하고 와지 지산 바메바서도 잠바데 시신店에 삼로데 네 미기에 철 두고는 어디 두고다 선배 람상 까지네 어디전에 야고 말씀 제 전식이店제 셈데 개회 철 받당고 그래서 삼당고 그래서 지산 디당고에 계신 거래 해서 지산 바메베 도초디 바위된고 그래서 바위된 거래서 지산 바위 맞된 바지 바메 제자바 샤바이나 안 디기 견진에 아주게 디바 먹고 사용을 했어. 지산 디바 마사에 된다라 아주 심 밤에데 까지 심 바위된 거랬어. 근데 바위된데 잠바데 시신이디 있다. 아주 또데 잠바데 시신이디 게 첨부 슈레. 지산 시신디기 삼로데 가래 가와 두도 밑에 제바제다. 삼다 따디고 시신이 돼. 시신이 삼다야. 시신디기 삼로데 미기에 초소 준시에게 줘야다. 미기에 초로 줘도 내가 줘야 초래 조로치도 남산 전식이 어디 전에 야고 말다 디진 디보여라서 남산 전식이 파 전전에 파 샘드 파 가고 그래지. 진짜 전바의 시진이 된제 샘 밤에 베게 밤에 바데 가제 바유송 제고래지. 바유 된고 그래서
Firstly, then, one needs to overcome our ignorance in the sense of lack of knowledge in terms of knowing what is non-virtuous, what is virtuous, what leads to suffering, what leads to happiness. This is important. We need to understand that killing and stealing and sexual misconduct and lying and harsh speech and divisive speech, etc., that these lead to suffering for ourselves and for others, and they must be abandoned. If we wish to have happiness, if we wish to spiritually develop, we need this knowledge. And secondly, non-conscientiousness. This is also a cause that leads to harmful behavior. So non-conscientiousness is second. First is not knowing. So here when we know, for example, that harsh speech or lying should be abandoned because it leads to suffering and prevents our spiritual development, but in a particular situation, we don't really care, we are then likely to follow our habituation, and we will lie, or we will speak harshly. Because if we are non-conscientiousness, it's very easy then to believe any excuses our minds make. Oh, if I speak harshly here, it's just a little bit of fun. Or if I tell this lie, it's okay, it's just a small lie. This is the fault of non-conscientiousness. Non-conscientiousness serves not to non-conscientiousness comes about when one doesn't think about the two streams of results for oneself, of suffering from engaging in non-virtue, as well as blocking the accumulation of virtue, or rather blocking our progression towards this happy states that we desire, the spiritual results that we desire. So this is so here we can think about conscientiousness, because another way we can translate conscientiousness is as care or being careful. So if one is walking along an uneven road and one is maybe a little bit unstable on one's feet, then one needs to take great care. Watch what one is doing, especially perhaps if you're thinking of walking along a precipice, especially if we're young and we don't need to be so careful when we walk. If you're walking along a narrow precipice, then we have to be careful. So this is the role of conscientiousness, or a mind that is careful. Because it's independence on being conscientious that introspection and mindfulness can stop us, in particular stop us from following our habitual tendencies. We're greatly habituated to an affliction, such as using harsh speech, or such as telling small lies. It's conscientiousness that will remind us, this isn't where we should be. This is not the direction we should be going in, because it impedes our spiritual development. And thereby, mindfulness and introspection can help ensure that we do not engage in non-virtue. So there's this relationship, this close relationship between conscientiousness, or being careful, and being mindful and between mindfulness and introspection. And it's these three, conscientiousness, mindfulness, and introspection, working in harmony, that enables us to make the right decisions in order to achieve the results that we desire.
당질에 심 밤에 발람나 심 아주 미게위게 졸야 삼로디 미게위게 삼로나라 삼 좋아디 다 밤에 가지고 벤심 삼로나라야 셈첸 소주기 사다 샬야 아니 균주의 지기 특수 시인습에 삼로인데 디 삼로데다 밤에 바차로 미게위 졸주고 그래. 진짜 다 밤에 비 도주의 바위에서 바위에서는 심 기위 초 삼다데 바위에서 다 샬레 펜버진에 야보래 한지 샬레 준마신에 야보래서 니네게 삼로디 당아주 삼로 기위 초 상야데 바위에 바지 삼로 미기위 삼로 날파 다야디
Non-conscientiousness is an affliction. It's on the side of non-virtue. Conscientiousness is a virtuous mind and on the side of virtue. And both of these play a role in terms of whether one's ongoing stream of activity at that time is in the direction of non-virtue or virtue. So therefore, these minds of non-conscientiousness or lack of care and conscientiousness or being careful are of great importance.
Geshe Thubten Rabten nyomo shu chimbo yobena andi genjene nga dipa manga sa gorwa chesa dene za deso ge ya nga tu temba de shijin tenje lamsa an nga ju ge samna nalia chichik khondu lesa de samsam chena lamsa odeti ne ya go mar ta simpegi on du samta ya da ya ji yu ji la sam chala thon de le ya a chakwa shi temba de shijin tenje de chakwa giro ji yu na 남사 tempe tenji odadi tele chapa kene ya ho mare sempi du sam da che ma ju gi nyomo ba ke ya ya song go re je re disa.
And thirdly, if we have a strong habituation to the afflictions, so that they in that they arise easily, or when they arise they're very powerful and dominate us, it's difficult to utilize mindfulness and introspection. Rather, we need first knowledge, conscientiousness, and to actively restrain ourselves, guard ourselves against allowing the afflictions to arise. This is important. And we do so through relying on conscientiousness, mindfulness, and introspection. Recognizing that it's the afflictions that are our enemies, because it's our afflictions that create the causes for suffering for ourselves and others and impede our spiritual development. So the third point is a strong habituation to the afflictions. And this impedes the cultivation of ethical restraint.
Da magu badla tene nga zo dipa mangbo sa gores cheza magu ba chi gyo mares magu be docho de la shanla gu ba che gores jire magu bala na shanla maga wa che benemi yende je da ben chike shanlia pember tu tu ya gora thomane soso gi lamsa odelia chike maga wa chi odadi gyönje je da dinigi anjik mongoli gura dine za anmi shanlia pember tu ka da ane chike chue shege na ya gora shege na dine ton abe ya gore sanbege koron ya gore wa sanbege dinigi yang zu gushepje gores 지나 제 다제 심제 탐제 심제 간의 신에 수수니 콘솔이야 니기 전에 야고로 와서 콘솔 둥아디 마전에 야고로 와서 콘솔에 야고지 콘솔이 자왈람로 야고 주네 배 야고로 와서 비게 삼다베 있나 하는 아주 콘솔이야 네 데네 녀모 콘도기야다 아니 고라다야다 주시야다디 됐노아 용그로와 데네자 델라 다 마구바제바이나 콜 마가바이나 gyönjejiada an ko lega dönda chugna di tuna be maruna ya urwa sa be samdayada an jike modus chene diba mongo damara leungurwa dine enza ta magu ba cheba dine ungure shisa magu be dogsho khare so sang so magu ba ki du mindu samda da jamba da shijin yi de samda je shijin 하고 해도 잠바티 오다 마고 셴라 마고 바지나 야고 오면 디부사 거디 삼체 람사 셴라 마고 바지 바까지나다 셴리아 구바치에 돼 코로나도 디기 주네 야고래 삼베게 코로나게 자발람로 야포 주네 야고래 삼베게 도스는 구바치 오레스.
And fourthly, if one is not concerned about the wishes or the welfare or the needs of others, this too then is a cause for faulty behavior. It's a cause that makes it very difficult to train in ethics. So here, this way of thinking is one where one doesn't really care about the impact that one's physical or verbal behavior has on others. If they're harmed by it, well, that's their problem. So this is a faulty way of this way of behaving only leads to problems for ourselves as well as of course for others. Here then we need to cultivate a way of thinking that is positive towards others, where one has a positive outlook towards others, where one wants all to be happy. And for ourselves and others to be happy, we need to be harmonious, we need to get on, and thereby we need to act in a way that is in accordance with the wishes of others, talk to others, verbally communicate with others in a way that is in accordance with their wishes. So here, through developing this way of thinking, we do care about the impact our behavior has on the others, and we ensure that our way of interacting with them benefits others, or at the very least, doesn't harm others.
Jizada nyomoba susugula nyomoba chembura chikidina nyamane da nyomoba komshi che yoba ina deletene anekaso tenshijingi tenshishin tenje ndusine andibo maya gitandala dibo masai gitanda betu chigores ana maguba ma jeba ina dibo yungo chiza maguba jina dibo yungo za maguba tosho guba tenje guba cheje ana duche gore tini che ne anga jogi diba 당번에 마야야라 마사에 당번에 마야야라 배주시야디 인디네시아 오래시 오르바당하죠. 디바 마야야 원고로 책으로 바당.
So these then are the four causes that lead to one engaging in harmful behavior. So these we need to know and train in right away. The first then is that of having knowledge about what the causes the afflictions to rise, what is the sequence that or the events that lead to the rise of the afflictions, as well as the great harm that the afflictions cause in our lives, so that we have the required knowledge in order to block the afflictions. That's the first. The second is to recognize non-conscientiousness, or not being careful, prevents our spiritual progression. And that here we have to train in conscientiousness. The first point, we need to gather knowledge. The second point, we need to train in conscientiousness. We need to be careful, recognizing that we need to always act in accordance with virtue, ensure our mind is always virtuous. This is being conscientious. Because if we are not, it serves to impede our spiritual development, as well as accumulate non-virtue. Then thirdly, the strength of our afflicted minds leads to any good intentions we have being lost, being overwhelmed by these strong afflictions that easily arise, and thereby lead us to act out the same old habitual patterns. So we need to recognize these strong afflictions and be on guard against them, recognizing that it's these and these alone that cause harm. Then fourthly, and here this is a better way now, I'll present a better way to translate what Genla has been saying. Fourthly, we need to be respectful towards others, recognizing the fault of being disrespectful towards others. Because when one is disrespectful towards others, one doesn't care about their welfare. One sees one's own needs as paramount. So we need to cultivate a respectful attitude towards others. So these are the four causes that lead to non-virtuous behavior, to harmful behavior, and we need to engage in the cultivation of their opposing minds, their opposite minds.
yang tiba saya dan dene yunguru wada mamjuge gedina jebe na le dambo enza nyamne jidu dene samta bine yang para la rashin tiba mambole yo da samnodi mat para de tem matu ba dene tiba saya yungure ane nyamane yang tiba sa shi yo mambo yunguru wa dene yamna garche gore labna delia 갈때 중야 동화다 윤인도 미로바 샤톰 수진도 지고야세
Now returning to the text, here the text recognizes that for us as beginners, it's difficult to change. Change doesn't come about readily, and also as we gather knowledge and we reflect on our past behavior, we start to see how readily we've acted in a non-virtuous manner. So then, returning to the text, to the 5th sentence, if you ever breach your ethical conduct, don't waste a moment, but immediately confess and resolve to proceed correctly in the future.
So that galde jungyang side kdang kisi denege nyamlen chebana sosugi nyam chebana denege am parala denege nga zele dangbo enza ani yapoche matwa dine tungwa chungbaina junyare dine chebana karche oresene da tungwa se tung sidu tungwa se de dipal la gore dipadikela tungla de garsan ma sahajo de sigurwa jaza nga jugi pene tungwa yoyagi ma 다들 아주 되기 위해 대바 되기 여바이나 아주 그변에 나서게 규디 동아 된 규디를 때는 아주 같이 벌서는 나서 마 사주고 동주고 봐 제상 아주 동아세네 다들 디바디고 그래 제상 되네게 아주 냠는 제바이나 되네 디바게시 디바 중앙나 같이 벌서 다들 사바 중앙 용그래 냠만은 디바 사샤바 용그래 대수 여바나 파 균이고 소스를 마샤바 제 남상 근데 샤돔지 오래지 샤지 매바스 오래지 벤긴 마선다 자마스위 수비네 저렇게 긴 내용으로 와 안 같이 오래라면 남산 차 오르마다 자기가 말지 샤바네 다들 뜻을 아 제일 뜻을 제일 마마 차도 그래서 그러와 제가 남산 동안 중요도네 디바 중요데 남산 파샤 오래 샤돔지 오래지 샤돔 맞아봐 샤샤바네 균이를 주도 야자 사야 이거 마마도 그래 제가 디네서 동안 균이도 미줘봐서 균이도 마샤바제 남사 샤돔 추진의 제고래 샤돔 추진의 제고에서 마샤고래제
Here our text in the English uses the term ethical conduct. In most contexts, usually we would just talk about non-virtue. The actual Tibetan here uses a less common word, and that is a downfall. So we can understand this word then, downfall, as being when one engages in non-virtue, or one engages in downfalls, or if one acts in a way contrary to ethical conduct, in a way that's unethical. So unethical, non-virtue, downfall, we can understand these similarly. A downfall, when one engages in a downfall, this particular term is used so as to show that when one engages in a downfall, one has accumulated causes that, should they ripen in a propelling rebirth, they will lead one to fall down into the lower realms. And the purpose of using this term is it immediately should turn one's mind to, that's not the result, a desired result. I need to confess and purify. Because if I don't confess and purify immediately, I'm unlikely to change, especially if this downfall is something I habitually engage in, something I have great familiarity with. So the usage of this word downfall, which in other contexts we usually say non-virtue, serves the purpose to remind us that if one has to immediately confess and purify, because it's engaging in such behavior, whether physical or verbal or mental, that leads to our future suffering.
kimbalma chöshide tunga sede sharash beshitan gomar tsikde dikpa sede beshitan gorwa tanganzo yang rabjung ma shede ane di tunga sede tsikde beshitan tunga sede nganzo ge sangi ge jeba dan gebe dikpa rangshin dikpa dikele tunga se war dinyu tanda dikpa dire za tsik beshitan dala rabjung ma ane sundu kabla an tunga sede beshitan gor tunga se sungor cheza dine za delia 동화 디바 말라 동화 소야디 아니 디 최소야디 디 소야조 mbele song za rabjung song sa de rabjung yurtes ma song de tungay ko shi go tungwa se bistang go sikti.
Where one mostly comes across this term downfall is in the context of teachings given to the ordained, because that is the word that's used in relation to transgression of vows. Where one transgresses one's vows, one commits a downfall. This text uses this word here several times for downfall. It's not translated into English in this way. The reason it was written in the Tibetan like this is because the text was composed for a primarily ordained audience. The reason it wasn't translated in this way is because this text was translated for primarily for a non-ordained audience. So in the context of a teaching given to the non-ordained, the term non-virtue is generally used. If this teaching were being given primarily to the ordained, the word downfall would be used. The meaning, though, is the same.
동화 샤바 된제 차 부야당 아주 가리나 참제 샤tum제 용거래 안디 멤비게당 아주기 요게 야라데 아니 고다 안첸 갑려야 디파사여베나 디소야 디네기 요게 야라제 아니 지기 연차 부여제 아니 차부 디파샤야당 아니 아직 니메고도와 디파샤바이 디파사여베나 고다 마니르지디 아니 차부 아니 지게 샤tum제야 디제네치네 아주기 남윤네 안데지 야에 랑디 갑려야 차세야다 마니디 니로치디 갑려 차세야다 디스용고르 데자 디가르랍나 마니디 니로치디 차푸야디 다 니메공을 갑려야 디바카르 사샤베나 디스파 샤tum지기 샤고가 예 다쇼베 야랑네 안에 지게 트위캡제 연자푸 차푸야디 부여도 안데 세나고 다 니데 생라 니삼로 코리아다 디네기 디과사여바이나 안디 샤tum제게 된 제산디네 장주게 디과 샤tum제라 다지게 제 뒤통통다 유능하다 뭐고용으로 앞에네 다 나고가 차세 디과 샤tum제 샤그레 안디메베다 소소 조야 디과 샤tum제게 된 참되제 안데 차 봄당 샤야다 안지게 이게 뭐 봄다 봄사야다 안디네기 나주게 다 지게 최고부야다 마사야나 되니 베지되야다 디베 샤tum제를 다 탑나서 중고로 지나 가지래 don달라 아주 디베 카라 사샤베네 샤tum제를 계신 버렸어. 근데 그도 들랑 저기 니에 미치링임 투제 아주 기시리 갑래 되 칸바 직수 쇼제 쇼바이나 직수 셴네 다 디바 사서 언소스레스나 어디징이 직수 빼사서다 너트 중샤 선배게다 데니게 당이 너샤 선배 야 소수기 둘이야 상계 셋업 제기 디바디 샤긴 베스 너샤 선배게 교바케제 안디 디바디다 샤긴 삼제야 메니 참고직 전화 되나다 되는 거죠 지게 배제로 직접 가시는 데니게 다 디바디 샤긴 선배 직되야만 그도 들이야 상계리야 대바제 안몰람 지켜베네 디바다 그래서 상계 킨 삼베나 그 샤좀 차르고 그래 가제 샤좀 들이야 그도 들 대야도 되지 Ninguém estivamos de baixo, só o dinheiro de pensar só nós já sempre que lamsa já sangueta, ande que tempo cheche, ande já, que vai cheche, né? Nós já de baixo daqui sangue que não tem chaquin pensar só dan, mal para de jime, samdin samdavena, de baixo autom chacho.
As our text says here, one must immediately confess and resolve to proceed correctly in the future. This is an important point to make. Previously, we've covered this in detail, so I'll just mention it here. Many practitioners ensure that at least in the morning or at night they engage in a dedicated session of purification practice, and in fact. Many do it both in the morning and the evening. But the key to purification being, or confession or purification practice being successful, is the application of all four opponent powers. These four, you'll recall that the order can change in dependence on one's own preference, but they are firstly generating regret for the non-virtue that one has engaged in, knowing that it both leads to the ripening, the accumulation of causes of suffering, as well as the impeding of our spiritual development. Then secondly, the basis, the opponent power of the basis, which is that of refuge and bodhicitta. And thirdly, the opponent power of restraint, where we commit to doing our level best not to continue with such non-virtuous behavior. And then fourthly, an antidotal power, where one can engage in any virtuous activity in order to purify the non-virtue one has accumulated. So some would choose to, in the morning, as part of their practice, to engage in the practice of the four opponent powers, and then they generate a regret, go for refuge and bodhicitta, so the opponent power basis, or the basis, committing to not engage in negativity such as these again, and then as their antidote, they'll set up the offerings on their shrine. Others will do this in the evening, recalling the negativities they've performed in the day, and then engage in the four opponent powers. And here they may engage in some meditation, such as mantra recitation, or meditating on emptiness or love, or whatever their practice is, or doing prostrations. Others in the morning may engage in similar antidotal powers of prostrations or particular meditation. So this is up to one, the antidotal power is up to one, but I would encourage you to try and do at least one session of the four opponent powers, of confession through the four opponent powers every day, whether in the morning or in the evening, and if you have time, certainly to do both. And when one is getting habituated to this way of thinking, when one is habituated to the four opponent powers, as then one, during the day, when one notices one has acted in a way that is non-virtuous, perhaps in a conversation with someone, one has used harsh speech, then immediately, mentally, whilst in conversation with someone else, one will recognize that was a fault, and that is contrary to one's training, and one can in moments apply the four opponent powers. And when one finishes the conversation and walks away, one can just recite, for example, the refuge prayer, and that can be the antidote. So in this way, one can even engage in the four opponent powers during one's activities in the day, even whilst in conversation or in activity with others. So this is important. And here we can see how utilizing conscientiousness, mindfulness, and introspection in our daily activity keeps us on the path of virtue, keeps our mind virtuous. And when we go in on a habitual way and we act in a non-virtuous manner, immediately we can rectify ourselves. And by utilizing these four opponent powers, this serves to develop our habituation towards virtue. It serves to break our habituation towards non-virtue, break our habituation of being under the influence of the afflictions. So using the opponent powers is very skillful. And if we build up that habituation in the morning and in the evening, due to the strength of that habituation, it becomes ever easier during the day that when we fall against the standards we've set ourselves, we can readily pick ourselves up, purify, confess and purify, and thereby ensure the rest of the day we stay on virtue.
인자 조지레 그때 가담바 초진 세셔 신기 초진 충주주요레스 지사 조지가 페나 디 냠도 해제 해로 거스 남피고 지사 디네자 페제 남사 지셈냐 안지게 딕비게 자와로 데데스 용베네 남사 초진디 바샤제 안디고라 겹제 두스고라 겹고레스 고라 겹제데 샤톰 차고로 언두스난 거래제 지사 돈달라 디기 가르랍지기고 쓰는 아운줄이야 디니 시고레스 랍지 뜬거로 와드미 조제 혼주다 미 냠냠바 센티버사야데 가고로 와데 이네다 아운줄이야 재산 되는 제고래스 재산 주주 유리 갑라 되니게 도스는 제고래스 제게죠 두고 그래 디발람사 되는 샤데 제고래스 주는 거 샤교 말사 디가솔야 제가 배춘 등고로 가서 등고로 되는 제고래스 랍진난 거만 난 거로.
In fact, Lama Atisha, wherever he went, he carried a small wooden Kadampa stupa. So similar to the Kadampa stupa being built outside, but much smaller and made from wood. And he'd carry that with him wherever he went. And whenever an affliction arose in his mind, he would stop what he was doing, place that Kadampa stupa before him, and circumambulate it. And he would do so as to purify that negativity and confess and purify immediately. And in this way, mentally he would engage in the four opponent powers, and the power of the antidote would be the circumambulation of the stupa. So being as developed as Lama Atisha, he wasn't readily accumulating non-virtue. His mind was not afflicted. But he would show this as an example to others. He would act as if an affliction had arisen within him and show this example to others that non-virtue needs to be recognized through conscientiousness, mindfulness, and introspection, and not left at that. Immediately, it needs to be confessed through the application of the four opponent powers, and in this way, spiritual development will come about rapidly.
다니네 얼마 디 곰데 동화 마고에 제세지 계신 직 태워둘라서 엔진나로이나 민디 다 되네 되나 되네 녀모바 강체와 디 님부 베네 곰데 동화 마고에 제신 레나 자와 지지장 덴베가다 미가와 랑기 랑라 미쳐와시 제고 앙스.
Then our paragraph concludes, but I'll be changing of the three remaining sentences. I'll slightly change the translation of the second of the three remaining sentences. When an affliction such as attachment, anger, or jealousy arises, meditate upon its antidotes such as non-attachment, love, or equanimity. In whatever activities you engage in, ensure that you are not sullied by non-virtue. Let nothing you think, say, or do contradict the advice of your teacher or the Buddha.
잠바 거미야지 예보대 지나다 되샤라서 버쳐와이나 아니 미도보 거미야다 아니 직델이야 아니 미다바 거미야 언도스진에 가서 아니 녀모바 가래 채워나 디 예보대 이엘 봐좀 이제 봐삼다 공고레스 두 검진은 가서네 공로 숙지 공로의 양생야생야스 레게데 되샤지라 말이야데 공로의 양생야 레게네 디겐지는 디바마 사고로 와지나 디네자다 공로를 봐 잠바잖냐 공제 잠바 마 공부에나 공로 되스 숙체를 중 땅고로 와지나 디네자 연보 가래 채와 있는 디 년보데 녀래야 맞아 봐 숙체 공고로 공제네 고 디네지는 맞아 디바마게 마요 마사야라 탑시고로 해지래.
When an affliction such as attachment, anger, or jealousy arises, meditate upon its antidote, such as non-attachment, love, or equanimity. What the text then is saying here is you look at your mind, see which afflictions you are most habituated to, and cultivate their antidotes, because it's these ones that arise most readily within you and tend to dominate. So remembering that a synonym for meditation is habituation. So here where one recognizes that one is particularly habituated to, say, anger and minds of that class, such as frustration and annoyance, recognize that within yourself. And then develop habituation to its opposing mind, which would be love. So if one recognizes that one readily gets annoyed or frustrated or angry, then cultivate intentionally the mind of love and thereby develop strong habituations so that through the utilization of conscientiousness, mindfulness and introspection, when we notice that the mind is going in the direction of frustration or annoyance or anger, then intentionally generate love. Likewise with attachment and its antidote, non-attachment and so forth. This is what we need to do. This is skillful training.
Leda Jawa Chichi Yang Dunbe Gata Mikawa Rangi Rangla Mitawa Chichi Guesaji. Leda Jawa Chichi Yang Dunbe Gata Mikawa Rangi Rangla Mitawa Chichi Guansidu. Then the Shikarsu was in the Laga Kare Chebina, Dunbe Gata Mikawa Chewores. She's a Dunbe Gagarasene, Sanji Garsumosene, Shalla Neba Chikio Mares, Shalla Neba China Diva Muras Mura, Chisan Zugida, Laga Kare Chebine. Chikson Chavina, Ranzuki, Laga Chevine, Diwaki, Chazamo Suvine, Chevine, Shalla Minuba Shores, Shiza, Shalla Minuba Shores, she's a Novena, Sanji Garson, Shalla Nugu, Nova Chigioma, Resura, Chiza, Ranzuki, Shalla Nova Chevina, the Sanji Gatan Katukuris, she's a Dineza, Cadillaga Carchevine, Sanji Gatan Migawa Chichores.
Then I'll reread my the translation of the second last sentence and then the last sentence. In whatever activities you engage in, ensure that you are not sullied by non-virtue. Let nothing you think, say, or do contradict the advice of your teacher. So teacher here specifically refers to the Buddha, but would also refer to one's spiritual teacher. And the advice here is clear. Always be aware of your mental activity, because if you're aware of your mental activity, you can restrain your physical and verbal behavior. And the very minimum that we need to do is always ensure we do not harm others. That is the minimum. And to make that even more of the bare minimum, we need to ensure that both our physical behavior and our verbal communication brings no harm. That is the bare minimum that we need to do. Because the refuge commitment of relating to the Dharma is not to harm sentient beings. So the bare minimum we must do is not physically or verbally bring harm into the lives of others. And ideally, we should do this through restraining not just our body and speech, but particularly our mind, and thereby ensure even our mental process doesn't bring harm to others.
Dan Dunbe Gata Mikawa Chigorse, Dumba the Zonga, that Dumba Sanju Jum Dendiri, that Dumba Sanju Jum, Karasan Dijin, Digboy or Dijin, Digboy, Kiawares, Sungandita, Dumba Sanju Jum Dendigi, Pot Dijin, Digbare, that Dijin, Gavar Sunganda, Taj again, Dumba Sanju Jum Dendi, Horong Ganara, and that Dumbi Garson, Shan and Deji Shebana. Ngāgōni tsūsū shēbādāng, tsūhīn shēbādāng, ngāchā shēbādāng, āni shēn lā chūshīn chēn dīkbā yōre lārwa. Chēsā dīne zā ngā tsūki shēn yī ngā tsū kīshī shēdū kāpari nā ngāgōni ngā pēchī tāndū, dā dīne kī tsūhīn mēmbā, tsūsū māyīmbā, āni jīka ngāchā māyīmbā dīne pēchī tāngu gōrēsī gōrwa, dā ngā tsū mīli kīshī shēbē pēni kīshī jambō shēbā, tsūsū mā shēbā chē, pēchī kī jambō nyembo shē gōrēsī gōrwa dā ngā chēlē. Chē tsūsū shēbā nā dā sāngī kī tsūsū mā shē, tsūsū shēbā nā dīkbā yōnggō rē sōngā zā, dēne sāngī kātāng kātō gōrēsī āchī tī sōngā. Chēsā dēne kī āni sāngī kī, āni kūmā kū yō mā rā sōngā rē, chēsā ngā tō kūmā kū nā sāngī kī kātāng kāwā rē, chēsā dēne dīn zā dī sō chā gōrē, chēsā sāngī kī tī kātāng mī kāwā chē gōrēsī. Dā rāngī rāng lā mī chā wā chē gōrēsī tū, dā lē kā rā chē nā pēnā ngā rā tsū kī nam yu na zu kin yi de yu wei ne de mi thong sa de yu ma ro a dang ye thong de mi ji la gu re sam che la gu re de mi la gong zeng a le ji sam che nga zu yu ma ra sa zu ji na mi me sa le de yin de pa yu she nya ga yo ro ba da che sa de ne sam ni mi me sa de le na so so o da nge yu na nge ji na ti nga ji ma re sam bi so so la nge no chu ji sam bi da so so le sam dang mo re che sa so so che yo ba se rāngi rāngla chāwā sīdhī sō rā sāma ngā lā jīchī nā yāqbōyā mā rī ngī nō chū chīgā ngā lā nū gī rī sāmbī kā sāma dāngwa rā chīsā dīnī yā sō sū kī dīkbā chēbā yā na 답변에 지딩으로와 미여세 갑려야 심지어 소셜 마제바제 디비치기메 도도라 직직 세마제 아나 미메도야 오다 쇠쇠하게 내가 여러 와데네 세번 제가 되네 세번에 미메데는 미샤다 마통네 소소기 어당이디 제바 있는 알지 뉴기리다 야고요만 알아 뉴기리 야고요 말에 셈비게 삼다제 소소소라 삼다제 그 디버 잼고레서 랑라랑 랑게랑을 쳐여 봐시디 랑게랑을 쳐여 봐시 소소소기 샹다게 통마통 샹다하고 고모걸 삼는 마다와지 소소랑 삼당이 지나 디노트르제당 알망고바네 디바데 디티부 두안용지 디디 말에 셈비게 두 삼다제 안내가 저기 디베 자와디게 봐 송고를 해서 송고를 됐어 랑라랑게 쳐여 봐시 디스고.
Just to talk a little further on the final line, let nothing you think, say, or do contradict the advice of the founder teacher, Buddha Shakyamuni. Here, we should understand this line, whilst it will include our spiritual teacher, but specifically about Buddha Shakyamuni, the founder teacher in the sense that it was he who taught what is virtuous and non-virtuous. In other words, what is virtuous in that it leads to happiness, what is non-virtuous in that it leads to suffering for ourselves and others. And the Buddha taught that if one engages in harsh speech, if one lies, if one gossips or engages in divisive speech, this creates the causes that will lead to suffering results in the future. Moreover, it brings harm to others too. Likewise, if one kills or steals, engages in sexual misconduct, this creates the causes that will lead you to suffer in the future as well as bring harm to others. So therefore, this last line, the final line here, says clearly, act in accordance with the wishes of the Buddha, which means to act in accordance with his teachings. Because in his teachings, he explicitly sets out how he wants beings to act, because they're acting in accordance with his teachings leads to all beings achieving happiness, all beings overcoming problems and difficulties and pain and sorrow. So what are the wishes of the Buddha? He wishes for us to be happy, just like we do too. Act in accordance with the teachings, and happiness will be achieved. And then moreover, what we don't have here in the English, it's in the Tibetan, it says specifically in the Tibetan that one needs to be the judge for oneself. So we have it a little bit, we have it in the preceding line in English, be your own judge in practice and do not fall short of your aims. So what it's saying here is that one needs to be one's own judge, not active, the Buddha is watching, or my teacher can or cannot see me. We are always around, we need to be aware of our own behavior. For example, we have a very strong habit in our society not to litter. Even if no one's around, people generally do not litter. If they can litter, no one will see. But they generally carry the garbage until they come across a bin. This is the attitude one needs to have, particular towards our mental activity. Others aren't aware of our way of thinking. Sure, the Buddha and our teachers are, but so are we, and where we are not, we need to, through conscientiousness, mindfulness, and introspection. This is our responsibility. It's in our hands. So we need to judge our own practice, not just on the cushion, throughout our day, and ensure we do not fall short of our aims.
디 당보나 마사야기 될 디버사의 유딜랑 가르친 리고르스네 주게데 예수 마신비 견진의 디버사 용식에 제가 디네자 디버 가르친에 가르친 디버 연구를 가르친 연구가 맞아 지 디버 가르친 연구에 예수 신부 지어가야 되게 침보를 해야지 지금 셈야지 신부인데라 마신 셈 밤에 제제 셈 디비 철파 즉 파다 잡아있나 안 디버사고 제가 셈디 파 디비 철 마다와지 파 송제 파 맞아 셈 바위 띵고를 기위 철이야 삼나가제 땅고를 지산 바위 띵고를 해서 근데 내게 안에 샤리아 구십지야다 안에 소수교 뭐 가르치베네 데술이야 다 지금 뭐 가르 슈체나 델이야 냠보 땡제 그도 냠보 땡제 어두스는 삼다데 계시 뭐시오레스 어두스 거래제 안 되네게 다니 하지 그 직디네 제바이네나 까브르까브라 소수기 노르체제 뇽부 디바사야다 나만의 디바사샤 바디네 요세 디네 요바이나 다 람사 가서 샤돔제 생아서 디바샤야게 삼다 샤돔제 거래세지 어두스는 디스키 쳔보레 송거와 디네 장한 저게 게디나 디네게다 삼노데 게비 촐파 삼단 디제네 디고 용거래 디네신 디고 디제네 디마레 선배게다 안주게 다 삼노 디네 삼다 저 송돔제야디 게침보 차고로 삼다 다 디네신 디고레 디젠 디고 다 잘라 뇌비게 자와세야데 자오이네 지금에서 더 되나가 주기다 잘라 뇌비 자와 지금에 스비드다 류다가 이유고네 잘라 뇌비 자와 지금에 송거로 하지 디네 지금에 선배 삼다다 안 계시 되네게 돼서 되네 노트에 준비나 람사 어당이 배사샤다 지마송 선배게 교바게 아니 야 람사 상계리아 템바체 상예테 상예케 당에 노트에 제송스 공다스타티 안디레 상예 둘이야 샤긴 선배게 삼다 노바나디 지금에 선배게 어두스는 삼다 되는 게 침보 책으로 받아 디 디레 제가 되네기 제네 내가 저기 주름송 와서 제거 디네 삼노디까지 숙제야 가르쳐가지고 도베 내가 저기 삼지 삼로나 개위 삼로데 땜을 두고 봐. 디네 땜도데 진 마음보다 가지고 제리야 띵이 좀 신이 두바이네. 아니 신이 두야 되게 레라. 델레데네 신이 용거래. 근데 신이 두발에 때네 당한도 동반이 도비게다 라동 신신의 라동 고미하다. 안데서 디네 신 두고 지자 디네기 다 추리면송 디네 띵이 좀 신이 냠는제 안데네 안에 셰랍 냠는제제 디네 냠는 제발에 때네 탈바 타고 그래 숨고로와 지자 디네 자다 띵에진다 셰랍이 냠내 약부 용야기 녀라 마슬 마손 사실 마손나 아주 추중이 냠는 제단 디리에 사지 디송을 때 디네 장한조 디톨이야 삼다야 디게 침모샤고래.
To summarize then what we've looked at today, we looked at tonight then that the basis for the attaining liberation or the method for attaining liberation rather, the method for achieving liberation is to train in the three higher trainings. And we've looked primarily at the basis for the second and third, which is the first higher training, that of ethical restraint. It's only in dependence on the prior cultivation of ethical restraint, which means in particular restraining our minds from the afflictions and ensuring it's always on virtue, that we have the required basis to later develop the higher trainings of concentration and wisdom. Tonight then, we've looked at then how to cultivate ethical restraint. To overcome these four causes that enable faulty behavior or harmful behavior, we need to cultivate their opposites. So first, develop knowledge. We need to gain knowledge of what is non-virtuous and how it comes about, how we end up engaging in non-virtue. So this is primarily understanding what are the afflicted minds, how they work. That's first. In dependence on this crucial first step, we need to rely on conscientiousness or being careful, always being careful of our mental process. And through that, we are conscientious as well about our physical behavior and our verbal way of communicating. Conscientiousness is the crucial second step. Through knowledge, we understand, the first step, we understand what leads to suffering. Conscientiousness ensures we keep our mind on virtue and not allow the mind to become afflicted, because it's keeping our mind on virtue that enables spiritual progression. The third is we need to recognize what are the strongest afflictions for us, which afflictions we are most habituated to, and train in their antidotes, and gain great familiarity with their antidotes. Fourthly, and here I'm going to correct my, or clarify my translation from earlier. Fourthly, we need to cultivate a respectful attitude towards others. We need to value others. Because if we value others, we have a respectful attitude towards others, we will act in a virtuous manner towards them, in a non-afflictive manner towards them. So these are the 4 trainings we need to engage in: knowledge, conscientiousness, training in the antidotes to our strongest afflictions, and training in having a respectful attitude towards others, valuing others. And in conjunction with these, we need to make great endeavors in whenever we notice an affliction arising, purify it, especially if we've acted under the influence of this affliction and acted in a physically afflicted manner or a verbally afflicted manner. And here it's particularly good if we can include in our daily meditation reliance on the 4 opponent powers, that those of regretful, a recognition and regretful non-virtuous behavior, the generation of the commitment of promise, where we will not engage in that further. Thirdly, cultivation of the restraint, that of refuge and bodhicitta, and then engage in an antidotal power, meditation, a meditation of virtue, or prostrations, or offerings, etc. And if we cultivate the strong habits in meditation, we will be very easily then be able to apply it, even whilst engaging in communication with others, whilst going about our daily activities. So this is the way we need to train. And here again, I'm just going to make some change to the text, to what I said earlier. These last 3 sentences, we don't need to delete what he's had, but rather insert 1 extra sentence. So looking at the bottom of the text, when an affliction such as attachment, anger, or jealousy arises, meditate upon its antidote, such as non-attachment, love, or equanimity, and there insert the sentence: in whatever activities you engage in, ensure that you are not sullied by non-virtue. And then continue with the text: be your own judge in practice, and do not fall short of your aims. Let nothing you think, say, or do contradict the advice of the Buddha. This is how to train. Train in ethics, the basis for concentration and wisdom. Thank you very much.